Tonight, we're leading off with a look under the hood of Oregon's economy. Some parts of the engine are running well, others not so much. Oregon's latest revenue forecast. That's our big story tonight. Not many TV news stations would tackle this story in the depth that we're going to, and for good reason. It's complicated and dense, and yeah, it can be boring. But come on, it affects all of us. And I know that you are smart and you care about a healthy state economy, so we are diving in. Oregon runs off a variety of taxes. The personal income tax and the corporate taxes are the two biggest and the most important in terms of economic health. So the state legislature gets a report from the wizards at the Oregon Department of Revenue who keep track of all the numbers and analyze those trends. Our guide tonight is Josh Lerner, the state's acting economist for now. He's leaving his post for another job outside of state government soon, but nonetheless, yesterday he took lawmakers through the latest report. This was the first slide. On the left, it shows that inflation is cooling down here in the West, but it was wildly high in 2022 and part of 23. And that graph on the right shows jobs. The number of openings is in gray and above the hiring rate, which is there in dark blue. But Lerner says that blue line shows it's actually very hard for a lot of folks in Oregon to get a job right now.
Where while a lot of the top line indicators for the economy are still doing quite well, right? Unemployment is still relatively low. The employment rate is still high. Job growth is still positive. Like there's a lot of good things about the labor market today, but the hiring rate has slowed down tremendously. That's kind of the dark blue line here in the chart on the right, where the actual pace of hiring, this is Oregon data, national similar, is the lowest it's been in about a decade, right? Job growth is pretty slow. So if you have a job, it's good today. But if you're looking for a job, it's harder to find one than it has been really in the last handful of years.
The labor market, labor having trouble finding new jobs if they're laid off or fired or leave, is that, can you characterize that as across the board, or is that in higher income jobs, or is that in lower income jobs?
I would say some of the weakness, especially in those more rate sensitive sectors, are what we would call middle wage jobs. Construction and manufacturing in particular has added few jobs or lost jobs in manufacturing's case in recent years. And so that's much harder to find a job today if you're searching for that type of employment. Also in terms of layoffs, though, certainly in the last couple of years, the big layoff announcements we'll talk about in a minute, and some of the trends we've seen are more in the high wage sectors, right? When it comes to high technology, software, saw some layoffs a couple of years ago. Now we're talking about semiconductor related layoffs in Oregon and apparel and footwear layoffs in Oregon and that sort of thing. So that's certainly much more tilted towards, college educated, higher paying positions and the like. And so there's even been the term white collar recession thrown around in some of the media reports and economists in the last couple of years. And so we've certainly seen that in the data.
So in general, Oregon's economic engine is running pretty well. But if you know someone out of work, cut them some slack, will you? It's harder than you might think to find jobs in some of our state's industries now. The state economist also had a bit of gloomy outlook for some of Oregon's biggest industries.
3 notes on the long-term outlook. I think the long-term outlook for semiconductors in Oregon is still bright. We have the upcoming investments, at least until if we heard something else, we would change that assumption. I think that is good news. The challenge today is that semiconductors in Oregon, while there's hundreds of firms technically in the cluster, it is dominated by one large firm, right? And that's the one firm where we're seeing the announcement. So maybe opportunities within other employers within the cluster maybe are a little more less diverse, just given that. Whereas footwear and apparel, right? We have a number of large multinational companies with headquarters or headquarter type operations in Oregon. And so while one of them may be seeing some layoffs, the other ones are growing. And so you're able to keep those workers with the skills, tailored to the specific industry cluster locally. And so the long-term outlook is strong. For wood products, we've been seeing the long-term structural decline in wood products in Oregon for 2 generations or longer at this point, right? And so I think when you see some of these closures, if we see full closures, it takes a lot of capital and investment to start back up again. And so I think you tend to see a ratchet down and then stability and then a ratchet down and stability. And so I wouldn't be super optimistic about long run growth for the industry, just given trend for the last 40 years.
Okay, so he's talking about Intel, the big chip company, which announced recently it will cut 15,000 jobs and save $10 billion next year alone. We still don't know exactly what the impact in Oregon will be, but it's definitely going to be felt here. And unfortunately, the future does not look great for those of you in the lumber industry, which I'm sure it does not come as a huge surprise based on how things have been going for some time now. But outside of that, many companies are doing well in Oregon. And while we're talking about corporations, I thought these graphs were interesting. The one on the left shows in the gray there how much corporate taxes have gone up relative to that smaller blue line, which is how much their profits have gone up. It's a big jump since 2015 or even since 2020. And on the right side, the graph compares Oregon's corporate taxes in the blue line to the median of state taxes nationwide. And as you can tell, we're kind of right in the middle of the pack. But getting back to the economic engine, personal income tax, the state economist says lots of people are working now in Oregon. In fact, more tax money is coming in than they predicted, and more taxpayers are filing than predicted. So what's that mean? Well, potentially a bigger kicker refund for you in 2026.
Okay, so I think bottom line for the general fund revenues, this is for the current budget period for 23-25, general fund only, are up considerably, right? Available resources are up $676 million since we last produced a forecast a couple of months ago. 2/3 of that change is tracking, right? Actual collections through the door in the last 3 months, are nearly $500 million above the forecast. And trying to think through what the implications there are, why that is such a large change. Is it that collections have boomed, much stronger than anticipated, or is it that our forecasts were maybe overly pessimistic, or is it the forecast was too low, or is it the revenues are much higher than fundamentally you would expect? And I think it's more the latter than the former. I think the flavor of the outlooks were right. We're expecting a decline in corporate, and we got stability in corporate. We're expecting a 50% decline in personal income taxes on a year-over-year basis because we're paying out the kicker, right? So net of the kicker would be up, but with the kicker, we expected a 50% decline last quarter year-over-year, and we got a 45% decline year-over-year. So I think it's maybe that the forecasts were a little too pessimistic, and it's not so much that the revenues are going gangbusters relative to the broader economy. I think that's part of it.
And the other part, he said, is $300 million more in corporate taxes coming in than expected. Because of the change, Oregon's unique tax refund law is probably going to kick in. Here's how it works. At the end of each 2-year budget cycle, the economists make their best guess on how much tax money is going to come in for the next 2 years. And if that number ends up being the actual number, if it's 2% more than what they guessed, then every taxpayer gets a refund, which is called the kicker. Currently, the state economists expect tax collections will be nearly $1 billion higher than expected, $987 million if you must know, which would mean a tax refund of between $200 and $400 for every taxpayer, depending on your income tax bracket. Those numbers will likely change between now and 2026, but that's where things stand right now. Also, as I mentioned before, Josh is leaving his state post, lured away by the private sector. Thanks for your service to Oregon, Josh.